Welcome, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. As folks are coming in, we will just get kicked off because this is a great discussion that is going to be before us. I'm really glad to have you with us today on what I think is a timely discussion about the 21st Century Road to Housing Act. This is a conversation that comes at a time when we have the first legislation in 40 years, massive legislation on housing at the federal level coming out of Congress. That on its own is a critical milestone to celebrate and elevate. And then there's so much more for us to do on what gets implemented and how do we make that happen. I just came back from speaking at a conference on the East Coast, and we had a lot of opportunity spending time with folks across the country, just digesting what is within the Road to Housing Act, what does it mean for our communities, and how do we activate our communities in understanding what's included in the legislation and how we can collaborate together. One thing that's really stuck out for me is how are we going to distill what's within the legislation and understand what can move forward today, but long term, how do we track what needs to move through appropriations and activate folks on the ground to push for those appropriations, whether that's fiscal year 27 or other cycles where investments will be needed to operationalize some of the great ideas around supporting housing supply, innovation and construction methods, and so much more that's been included in the legislation. So there's a lot for us to lean into and collectively just have conversations on, because all of you are here. We're getting the hard part done, which is we're finding ways to finance housing. We're navigating land use and permitting. We're the ones on the ground needing as many more tools as possible and being able to make sure that we materialize any opportunity that's helping facilitate that, in my mind, is the big opportunity that we all have collectively as communities. So I hope this discussion will move us. I'm confident it will move us in that direction of the conversation as a community. So I want to talk a little bit about the discussants who are joining us and the partner who's presenting with us as you will be listening in. But we're hoping this can be a natural conversation that we're having in this room. We are joined by Mike Kinsella. Many of you know Mike from Up for Growth, who will be presenting the overview of the legislation as folks who are boots on the ground in DC, working in collaboration with partners across the country in moving this legislation forward. We're also joined by members who will be discussing issues coming out of this legislation that are relevant for our market here in Washington State. We're joined by Elizabeth Murphy. Many of you know Elizabeth from Baker Tilly, formerly at Plymouth Housing. So she's here in a new capacity in helping us understand what on the financing side are we gleaning into from this legislation? What are the opportunities? What are some limitations? And how do we digest those at the local level? And then we're also joined by a great friend, Jess Zimbabwe from Environmental Works. She's here. All of you know Jess. She has a robust background in architecture and design and will be helping us really think about the supply components of this bill and how do we leverage what's been laid out, how do we make real what is included in the legislation and understand it fully here collectively. And then we're joined by Jackie Monahan from the Washington State Housing Finance Commission. Many of you know Jackie. Jackie makes projects feasible in this region, and she's here bringing in the financing perspective of the Housing Finance Commission. They are the ones coordinating really as an intersection between what comes out at the federal level with the tax credits and other programs to support our own construction here at the local level, and we'll be providing a perspective of what are we seeing that's real today, and maybe posing questions of some of this still has a long way to get there, and how do we make it real long term. So looking forward to a really robust discussion, but here to facilitate the conversation and moderate it is another great friend, Doug Trump at The Ebonist. Many of you know Doug for his great writing and leadership at The Ebonist. And he's here, he's dove into the 21st Century Road to Housing Act to moderate a conversation and think about what this means for housing here in our market in King County as well as in Washington State. Doug will be moderating the discussion. So with no further ado, I will hand over to you, Doug, to take it away.
Thanks, Patience. Glad to be here. I've been covering housing policy for about a decade at the Urbanist, so uh, I know a little bit about it. I think that I'm not an expert on the Road to Housing Act yet. It's such a massive bill, but I'm hoping after today's panel that we'll definitely at least be closer down that road to being, versed in this. Um, but I have, covered or watched some of the coverage of the passage of the act, which was passed on July 10th. Um, and Enterprise, which is a nonprofit that braids together a lot of different funding so nonprofits can actually build housing. They're kind of a big player in this space and helped lobby for the bill. They said it was the most significant piece of legislation in decades from the federal government. And that's definitely to underscore how big this topic is. I think it's also a little bit of indictment about what the federal government's been up to on housing in the last 20 years as well. That's definitely the backdrop of this. It's a huge bill. Another thing that Enterprise CEO Donovan said was it will unlock funding, but most of the provisions are only as good as implementation. So we will be getting into that implementation here today. But let's just start off of how it will affect housing supply. How can it help increase housing production and address regulatory barriers? And I guess why don't we start with Mike maybe on this one?
Sure. Well, thanks, Doug, and just to confirm, I have a bit of a presentation. I think Patience has asked me to present about 20 minutes or so, and then we're going to get into the panel discussions. That I just want to make sure that's good with everybody. Doug, that's your.
Yeah, I think that's probably better. It's probably going to be hard to ping pong back and forth. So take it away, and maybe you can
Sure.
take us along the way to answering that first question, and then we'll get into some of the other topics.
Excellent. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I've got a slide deck that we've put together. Hopefully you can see it, and I'll just dive in. So, as you said, Doug, 21st Century Road to Housing Act is the most consequential housing bill passed by Congress in 30 years. This is certainly, I think, labeled as once in a generation. We're certainly hopeful that this is not the only housing bill of this scale in our generation, because everyone knows we need to, it is a public policy imperative to solve the housing shortage and affordability crisis. And so I'd like to say that this bill is a meaningful down payment, but it is not a complete solution. And there's so much more for Congress to tackle. And by way of background, that's the work here at Up for Growth. As Patience mentioned, we are a Washington, D.C. based housing policy organization. We're a coalition with over 300 organizations in our membership around the country, including Housing Development Consortium of Seattle King County. And so just so excited to be part of this conversation and sit with you all today to talk about what comes next. So the focus of my talk here is the bill. The bill is big. It's over 400 pages, 59 provisions. I'm not going to cover every single provision here, but just know that Up for Growth is happy to be a resource to anyone interested in any particulars in the coming days, weeks, months, as this bill rolls out through the various federal agencies and ultimately implementation where the rubber hits the road at the state and local level. So I'm going to cover what the act does, what it doesn't do, and what Washington State's housing leaders have the opportunity to do to make full opportunity of this new legislation out of DC. So I've identified four key areas of discussion that I know Patience mentioned that this group would like to really drill down on. First, we're going to talk about 12 provisions related to housing supply. Second, we're going to dig into housing finance, and I'm not going to try to attempt to match Jackie's expertise here, but I'll tee up some of the pieces from a federal lens, and looking forward to the panel conversation. Third, there are changes to the home and CDBG programs that we'll discuss as well, which of course have a lot of importance in community development happening across the state. And then finally, we'll talk about home ownership and preservation. Cutting across all three of these topics are questions and considerations related to local implementation, development and housing delivery, and generally speaking, what comes next. So, what am I talking about there? On local implementation, there's going to be a role for the state, for the HFA, for counties and local governments, as well as local community-driven organizations. Under development and delivery, first of all, appropriations is a gate on many of the new programs created by this bill. In fact, all of the new programs created by this bill are authorized but not yet appropriated, which means there has to be a lot of advocacy in the coming year, and that's advocacy that we're gearing up for and excited to engage with each of your organizations on that work because it is going to be a lift no matter what happens in November. And then finally, what are the holes remaining, right? We know that Road has all of these provisions, but what is the next step? And I think, Doug, to your point, the federal government sadly has disinvested decade after decade in the housing safety net. And from our perspective, much more work needs to be done relative to housing, tenant-based and rental and project-based rental assistance. There are HUD accounts that have been just, underfunded year after year. And so while our organization certainly believes that the best cure for our housing affordability crisis is building a lot more homes of all shapes, sizes, and price points, we have to do more work on the demand side. And I'm going to try to touch on that as well. So let's get into it. Housing supply. There are 12 provisions pertinent. I'm not going to dig into the details because I do only have 20 minutes to cover this material. But I'm going to try to provide for each of these four sections sort of the cover the waterfront as far as what is in the bill and what each of you might have interest in. Invite questions on any of these particular provisions. But just know I'm going to kind of skim the surface in this initial presentation. So I think there's a few things, right? One is this question of how can the federal government incentivize and equip more local governments to reform everything from zoning and land use policy to process to even building codes. And I think as you look at this list, you'll see several provisions aimed at those questions. One, a late add, fairly late in the process of developing 21st Century Road to Housing was Section 102, which charges the federal government to develop federal model code guidelines for single stair buildings. Now, Washington State already in Seattle, you can build this as of right. But that is not true in most other American cities. And so I think Washington has the ability to set the example and to lead. And for the architects on the call, I think there's a real opportunity to engage as implementation of this provision moves forward. On the zoning side, Section 107, Housing Supply Frameworks, was initially led by a very interesting duo of members of Congress, Mike Flood, a Republican conservative from Nebraska, and Brittany Pettison, a Dem member from Colorado. Essentially, what this provision will do is stand up a federal task force on best practice land use and zoning policies. HUD will aggregate those best practices and establish federal model codes, both for state legislatures to take up vis-a-vis similar actions to what Olympia has taken up recently around, for example, eliminating exclusionary zoning. It will also generate model local zoning codes that cities and towns around the country can pick up. Now, this isn't without precedent, and I'm not going to go deep on this because this crowd knows exactly the history of exclusionary zoning. It was, in fact, the federal government, the Standard Zoning Enabling Act, that was the Johnny Appleseed of exclusionary zoning around the country. And so this is an opportunity for Congress and the federal government to correct a wrong that occurred over just a few months over 100 years ago. So that's a provision we're quite excited about. There are provisions related to NEPA. I know, Jess, you are very dialed in on the environmental piece, so I look forward to hearing your comments. But essentially, the provisions within this bill do not gut NEPA, but they aim to streamline that approval process and strike a better balance between speed of affordable housing delivery and infill housing delivery in particular, as well as, of course, protecting the environment. Part of the rationale here is that most states, including many states, including Washington State, have statewide environmental protections, and thus NEPA is really a duplicative and time-consuming step in the process that policymakers ultimately concluded can be eliminated, waived, or devolved to local authorities, thus saving time, which is really exciting. And the final note I'll add is the Accelerating Home Building Act. Now, I know most of the folks on this call are focused on affordable housing or even workforce housing at scale, as opposed to individual single-family homes. A lot of the proponents of this provision really had single-family homes in mind. Think about the Sears Roebuck catalog, or actions taken down in Sacramento, California, or other jurisdictions that have established these catalogs of pre-approved building plans, where if you are a builder, you can go to the permit counter, get your plan, you avoid plan check and all of the time of duration associated with that, and put shovels in the ground same day. What I think a lot of people don't appreciate, what I'm trying to get the word out on, is that multifamily builders can take advantage of this provision as well. From an implementation perspective, my advice is act now. If you're an affordable developer, go meet with your cities, encourage them to apply and offer your assistance to develop standard, widely applicable, affordable housing, multifamily building plans that can be included in these pattern books once they are funded by this new HUD grant program. There's a lot more in here, and happy to come back to any of this material as we get into the Q&A. And again, there's a lot of words here on these slides. I will provide this deck to patients and team at HTC so we can get this circulated out to everyone. All right, moving on to housing finance. There's a lot under the finance piece. I will caveat all of this to say there are not substantial new money provisions in this bill. This bill was by design, and due to the fact that it, for anything to move, it had to be bipartisan. Really appropriations were off the table, as well as a tax title, right? If you look at the bill, you'll see, there is no tax title. None of the housing tax proposals that have been in circulation were included. And this is why, right? The reality of Washington. But having said that, there are a number of provisions that we're quite excited about that I believe have the potential to move the needle if implemented effectively. And that's going to take continued advocacy from everyone on this call and obviously across the country. Some of the highlights include the bank public welfare investment cap, which lifts the, Jackie, I know you're nodding your head, the demand side of the LIHTC market, folks who buy that credit, particularly since the reconciliation bill passed last Congress, which decreased the bond test from 50% to 25%, meant that there's just a lot more credits available out on the market. And as a result, in the face of, frankly, pretty fixed demand, we've seen pricing for $1 of housing tax credit drop into the 70-cent range, right? So about a 30%, up to a 30% discount. And so the hope is by allowing national banks to invest up to 15% rather than 20% of funds in the housing credit, we're going to boost demand and increase that pricing so more money flows directly through to affordable housing development. There's a couple other pieces and parts in here, but I would, and a lot of it has to do with community banking, which was a priority of Chairman French Hill, not necessarily super impactful when it comes to affordable housing delivery, but the Opportunity Zone program is a program that has certainly driven more money into real estate development across the country. It's fallen short of meeting expectations when it comes to boosting affordable housing development. We've seen Ritz-Carltons in places like Portland, Oregon built with this, but not as much volume as we would have hoped to see on the housing front. So take a look at Section 201, which is a preference policy for projects utilizing housing grants through U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development for opportunity zones. We can, I will say I'm not a tax expert, but I know the folks to point you to if you have specific questions on that piece. And then finally, Section 211 lifts FHA multifamily loan limits, which have not tracked inflation for many years. And so we believe this is a long overdue adjustment, injecting more liquidity into the housing system. So I'm not going to drill too far down other than to kind of underscore there is no increase to the allocations. There are no tax law provisions. We are optimistic looking ahead that there is more appetite. We know that Congress, as a general matter, has a lot of appetite to do more housing legislation. I will say that beyond the individual particular provisions in road, this certainly individually and collectively will drive measurable impact on boosting supply. The biggest thing we got out of the bipartisan passage and enactment of road is the opportunity to take another bite at the apple. And so we are very focused on taking advantage of the wind at our back, the good feelings about a huge bipartisan win. Constituents across the country are continuing to tell their members of Congress, we have to solve housing. I can't get into home ownership. I'm paying far too much for rent. My kids aren't able to live in my town or neighborhood or get that job because housing is just so expensive. So members have the will to do more. One of our potential scenarios here, depending on how things shake out in November, is that a tax bill will be on the table. And we have on our agenda no less than 7 tax provisions that we think could be a good fit politically for the next 2-year cycle. Happy to unpack that in a bit as well. Nothing in the housing finance portfolio that I shared needs an appropriation. Right? Many of these are self-executing. For example, the FHA loan limit adjustment is quite prescriptive in statute as to where those limits should go. Now, there are some study pieces, but we believe that in the immediate term, we're going to begin to see FHA deals sized to the new limits, and the hope is that through some of the work in this bill and regulatory work outside of it, MAP program underwriters will be able to move forward quicker at the project's level in the coming years. Moving over to the HUD programs, Home and CDBG. Look, the home reauthorization and reform provisions, Section 501, is big. Not only is it a reauthorization of the underlying program, but it begins to get at some of the cross-cutting barriers to affordable housing development that add cost and add delay to the process. We talked about NEPA, and NEPA is part of that. There is a study element, there's a study element that relates to the BABA issue. Now, the BABA issue is not solved through this provision. And in fact, there is additional legislation that recently was introduced after the enactment of ROAD from Congresswoman Goodlander of, I believe, New Hampshire, if memory serves, and Congressman Mike Flood, the Nebraskan Republican I mentioned earlier on frameworks, that has legs. And we're excited about a particular piece of that, which is a shot clock that a BABA waiver request would be deemed approved after 90 days unless HUD affirmatively declines such waiver application. And again, for context for folks unfamiliar, these BABA procurement requirements on a subset of building components can add as much as 10 to 15% of cost of the project. Waiver processing is ridiculously slow. And we understand out of the 300 some odd waiver applications sitting at HUD, less than a handful have been approved. So that's definitely a piece of the home program to watch and to engage in the coming months and years. I will also sort of call out a very new idea of policy, which is the Build Now Act, Section 213. Providence here is Elizabeth Warren working with, believe it or not, Republican Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana. The idea is to incentivize more local governments and state governments to do what has already certainly begun to happen in Washington state. So the idea is that there are loads of communities that are low vacancy, high rent growth, and have a shortage of homes, of rental housing in particular, but homes across the board. What this provision does is it establishes a scrutiny pool of CDBG recipients. And within that recipient pool, HUD will assess, and this will be based on a clear and objective formula established in statute. HUD will assess, are you meeting your fair share of housing production? In other words, and it's a very simple structure, are you above or below the median point line out of jurisdictions in that scrutiny pool? If you're falling below the average jurisdiction in a scrutiny pool, you stand to lose up to 10% of your formulaic CDBG each year. The flip is that if you exceed the 50% median mark, you're going to get bonused out extra CDBG dollars based on the number of units that your community has produced. And so jurisdictions in Washington that are taking advantage of those commerce grants from a land use and planning standpoint, or jurisdictions that have, say, grant programs for equitable TOD, or jurisdictions that have reformed zoning to allow more as of right duplexes, triplexes, and single detached neighborhoods, stand to win additional CDBG money under this provision. So this is trying to get dollars to chase housing production and really support policymakers at the local level that have to take those hard votes, provides them with some cover and economic benefit to doing so. And I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to kind of run through the end here on home ownership and preservation. Patience asked me specifically to speak to the Housing Supply Expansion Act, which is a really wonky provision that relates to the HUD Manufactured Housing Building Code, which is our only federal building code. Currently, to be considered manufactured housing, you have to have a steel chassis, and that's a relic of history, right? Back in the 1960s and 70s, when we were building manufactured housing, practically speaking, you have to take them down the road and to install in a pad and deliver to the user. Today, we're in a world where you have offsite construction, you have construction happening in factories, you have volumetric, and you have panels built, and these things are getting assembled but not built on site. Even though in terms of the envelope and the product type, we're talking about effectively the same thing. It does not qualify as manufactured housing per the old 1960s HUD code. And so you can think of this as really modernizing the code in a way that we're creating a new national building code for anything factory built. That has huge implications for the scaling of modular and offsite construction, which is something that I know leadership in Washington State is quite focused on. I believe, Patience, you're leading some efforts around this through HDC. And we're just quite excited about the opportunity. I think it's arguable that this could be the most impactful provision out of the entire bill. There are also financial elements here, including the Modular Housing Production Act, which, similar to the Title I provision mentioned earlier, messes around, increases those loan limits. But there is so much more work to do. 203K, vouchers, direct funding for more affordable housing production. And I know you all are experts, and so I won't dwell on the work ahead of us, other than to say there's lots of work ahead of us. And I'll sort of wrap with a timeline. So we're sitting here in August. Senate THUD appropriations bill text is not yet out. There is House language in circulation. In October, fiscal 2027 begins, and we expect budget process to move over this period of time. So advocacy for appropriations for all of these new programs, I believe the count is 10 that are authorized but not yet appropriated. That's going to begin right around the corner. And then furthermore, if any of you all remember sort of the HOTMA legislation that passed back in 2016, that bill, believe it or not, is still being implemented. There are pieces of statute in HOTMA that have not been fully implemented by HUD. We're looking at a HUD that has had upwards of 30% staff rift due to DOGE actions and decision making in this administration. I am concerned. I think many of my colleagues in DC are concerned with the capacity of HUD to effectively implement many of these provisions. So we are playing the long game. And I believe looking ahead to 2029, a new administration, if history is any guide, right, a reversion, there are going to be further opportunities, not just to do more, which we must do, but to implement a lot of this great package. So hopefully I've been helpful in sort of laying the landscape on road. I'm really excited for this conversation, and so I'm gonna stop here and hand it back to Doug to kick off the group conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mike. Yeah, bring some more folks in. I think you did a really good job of laying it out, but just in case anyone else had anything to add on, will this increase housing production as written? Obviously, a lot of this is unfunded, but to kind of wade into that, yeah, why don't we go to Jackie?
Hi, everybody. Jackie Moynihan. Let's see, what am I going to add? I want to underscore we're in the long game. And for the tax credit in particular, the financing, which Mike laid out really great, is like a lot of those financing provisions are really focused on the banks. And so the public welfare investment cap is really the big piece that we've been looking at and we're excited about. But I want to raise up for everybody here, if you're not tracking proposals on the Community Reinvestment Act that are out for public comment right now. The proposals and that's also another very big, giant 400 something page document. But the piece that's really critical is that there is a proposal to change the thresholds for the banks. So what qualifies a bank as a large bank? And the changes that are being proposed would really push up those thresholds that effectively would reduce the number of banks that would be subject to the tests under CRA. So effectively could then reduce the amount of banks that are in the playing field to invest and therefore undermine the public welfare investment cap that just got raised. So I think we are excited about the cap raise, but we are also acknowledging that, as with all things in this industry, one thing is very dependent on another thing happening in another sphere. So really want to elevate that for folks if it hasn't been on your radar. There's going to be a lot of advocacy around those proposals. We've been on calls with NCSHA as our national convener of housing finance agencies across the country. They are certainly putting together a response. So that feels like a really critical piece because, as Mike already explained, and you are all feeling like tax credit pricing is down, appetite feels low with this now uncertainty under the Community Reinvestment Act. That just adds a little more uncertainty into the market, which are all things that we don't really need right now to make progress. But I think aside from that, we are certainly excited to see where do things actually go over the next couple of years, with HUD carrying really like 70% of the load to do all the rulemaking. That's a pretty big lift. So excited to see what happens in the future, but we are also very cautious. So maybe I'll stop there.
Yeah, and Elizabeth, anything you wanted to add? I know you work with developers at Baker Tilly, so is this sort of getting a groundswell of anticipation and interest, or is it more of a wait and see what actually gets real money behind it this fall, or who knows
Yeah,
when?
I think people are cautiously optimistic. I think developers tend to be a little bit there's trepidation about what it's actually going to do. So I think, like Mike said, implementation is going to be key. I am though, look, I was trying not to be so pessimistic when I was preparing like what I wanted to say for this. But I am really excited about the reforms and modernization to the home program, especially because that is such a vital gap funding resource for a lot of our developers. And ever since BABA, or Build America, Buy America, was weaved into that, a lot of developers have been kind of staying away from home as a potential source because it does add a lot of additional red tape and requirements for them to get waivers. It prolongs a lot of construction timelines. I'm sure Jess will talk about that from the architect standpoint. So I think in a time, as Jackie said, where pricing is down, where there are a lot of things kind of working against us economically with tax credit pricing, investor appetite, having those gap funding resources is really vital. So I am hopeful, and I know Patience put it in the chat that they're kind of looking at BABA. It was one of those well-intentioned pieces of legislation that got applied to housing. Obviously, we all want to see more American manufacturing. But when we're talking about a multifamily building with hundreds of thousands of components, it's very hard for a developer to navigate that. So I am really excited, and I know a lot of developers are excited to see the changes hopefully come out of that. And hopefully it'll make it easier to pair with LIHTC. I was also excited to see that CDBG is going to be expanded to new construction. That's another very vital gap funding resource. So, hopefully more gap funding for developers available there. And then we didn't talk a lot about this, but I know some folks might be from housing authorities here, and were some changes to the RAD program. They're raising the cap on the amount of units that can go through the rental assistance demonstration program, which allows housing authorities to recapitalize units. So there are definitely a lot of really positive things. Echo what Mike said about developers, especially reaching out to their local jurisdictions to take advantage of some of those incentives. And we're lucky here in King County, a lot of our jurisdictions are already doing that work. But I think, expanding uh, more zoning reform, other things that is going to make affordable housing a lot easier will definitely motivate developers to build in other areas, not just concentrating in Seattle and other kind of metro areas of King County, but really getting to those areas of King County that need more affordable housing. And there's a lot more to say. It's a big bill with a lot of stuff, but I think that's those are the highlights for me.
Yeah, thanks for that. And for folks following, I mean, we're mostly expert, or industry wonks here, but CDBG, Community Development Block Grant, for folks trying to keep up with all the acronyms we'll be throwing at you. Uh, and yeah, Jess, anything you wanted to jump in on the supply, and is this going to actually increase it? Question before we move on.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Thanks. And I'll just add on to what other folks have said. I do think this bill is a long laundry list of mostly good housekeeping kind of items. I feel like it reads like when I first read the summary of it, it read to me like Elizabeth Warren had just been keeping an open notes in her notes app on her phone for like 3 years of like ideas. And that every conversation she had with somebody, she was like, "Oh, but that's put in there too." So there is a lot of just kind of good housekeeping of cleaning things up. I do think streamlining NEPA and some of the other regulations is important and will have a potentially immediate impact. BABA, as Mike noted, was also cleaned up by some subsequent legislation. But I mean, we have a project in the Puget Sound region, large 100% affordable multifamily project that returned $1 million of funding because of the potential added costs and delays between BABA and NEPA. There was like a NEPA sign off we needed from Fish and Wildlife that was going to be delayed because of short staffing at that agency because of Doge. And then, so that was going to add to the timeline. And then it was like $1 million of funding, but the added cost for BABA compliant, just the lighting fixture package was like $300,000. And we weren't able to confirm that we could even find a domestic manufacturer who made a lighting fixture package that complied with Washington state energy codes versus the ones we were going to buy from abroad. So just all the layering, like all of these, individually well-intentioned, as Elizabeth noted, policies layered up to just make the project return a significant chunk of federal money. So I think unlocking some of that with streamlining might help immediately with projects that could access those funds. The other stuff, I do think we're gonna have to wait and see when they get appropriately funded and budgeted and staffed, right? There was a question about pre-approved housing plans. That sounds like a great idea in a different version of HUD where, I mean, right now, PD&R, what's PD&R stand for? Public Policy Development and Research, the division of HUD that will eventually probably pull those pre-approved plans together is at like 75 or 80% reduced force because of Doge cuts from last year. So nobody's pulling that together right now, but it's a framework in place that when that is funded and staffed, it could be hugely impactful. I think it'll mostly be a benefit to Washington state communities because, as I've noted, Washington state itself and several of the jurisdictions here locally are already sort of innovating, and so they will be rewarded in the way this structure is set up for the innovations they've been doing and trying to remove obstacles, trying to break down silos. I mean, the last week's announcement from Mayor Wilson about the ombudsperson to do with interdepartmental approvals of land use for affordable housing. I don't think she got that idea only waiting for this bill, right? They were already going to be looking at things like that, but that will encourage other jurisdictions to do that kind of work as well. So it'll be impactful here, but it'll take some time before we see it turn around, right?
Yeah, and I just want to flag on the implementation piece as well, because people have been doing a good job of flagging that could be an obstacle, and some of whether HUD's able to move quickly on this. This law became law without the president's signature, which was related to him holding it hostage for another priority of his, which was voter ID, sort of a what just critics kind of framed as a voter suppression effort. So I don't know if that means he's going to continue to track the bill, um, or the larger piece of legislation and throw hurdles in because it's not, not his baby. But it's definitely, a wrinkle in this. Um, and hopefully they're still able to get the funding to follow this up in the rulemaking. Um, but since we brought up the community development block grants, I wanted to kind of drill in and how these changes might affect that program and the kind of communities and housing providers trying to get those because Mike did a pretty good job of introducing it. But if there's any other further thoughts before we move on, because that is obviously one of the bigger changes, and there's over $3 billion that go to those grants, but they're so complicated, like it was brought up, that they don't always get used. And anyone who wants to weigh in can, I don't know who would have the most expertise on that.
I'll just sort of share because we were fairly involved but not the policy developers here. Uh, Salim Firth with the Mercatus Center, Ed Glazer with Harvard, and Alex Armlovich, now with Coefficient Giving, were the three subject matter experts that were most involved in crafting this legislation. From a TA standpoint, obviously, it's Senator Warren and Senator Kennedy's bill. But just yesterday, Salim posted a map and fairly comprehensive analysis of what is likely to play out based on current production trends around the country. So I just dropped the link in chat, and we'd encourage anyone interested in this provision and CDBG funding impacts to take a look.
I also wanted to touch on the home ownership and preservation side of this. Um, there's some new opportunities that exist for whole home repairs, for housing counseling, and then the whole kind of new manufactured homes thing. Um, which Mike brought up as potentially one of the more impactful things since it's a completely different delivery method that could be cheaper. Um, but traditionally it seems like a lot of our federal policy has been geared at multifamily, but there is more of this home ownership and preservation side of things. So I'm curious if any of our esteemed panelists want to kind of add more to that.
Well, I'll jump in. So a couple of quick comments. Whole home repairs is such a critical program. It's based on a successful pilot out of Pennsylvania, and stands to drive more money into the rehabilitation, preservation of both single family stock as well as small, affordable multifamily. The challenge is under Section 1202, there is no appropriation. And so while Congress said this is a good program, it should be created, there's no money attached. And so this is where advocacy for funding is going to have to be sustained advocacy, and this plane will not land until that funding is secured. Um, so, I zooming out, I think there's an interesting sort of conversation. There are a couple of relevant conversations around homeownership here. One, I'm very interested in the intersection of the chassis reform provision with pattern books, and if it might be possible for local jurisdictions to create patterns for modular. So that I think will require an enterprising state HFA, perhaps, potentially state legislature, and I think you have that in Washington. Number two, I'm sure everybody very familiar with sort of the noise around what was initially Section 901, sort of the build to rent ban. Within that piece, there is a business of renovate to rent. private firms. I think there's about five sort of in the business of driving money into existing housing that's basically uninhabitable, fixing them up, renting them out. And that's very different than buying homes off the MLS. And so I do think as rulemaking happens on what is now in the final bill, Section 1001, there's an opportunity to get it right. And there's an opportunity to write the rules so that we can actually increase the level of investment in the private rehabilitation of existing housing to create new habitable units around the country. Now, I don't know the map well enough in Washington State, and I'm not sure what the opportunity set ultimately is, but I do think that if there are stakeholders in the consortium that are in this business, I would encourage them to engage in the rulemaking conversation. And the good news, bad news is that we have been meeting with HUD and Treasury, working with our coalition partners inside Washington that have been having a number of meetings as well. And the assessment, the latest assessment, there is no way Treasury is going to write these rules in the amount of time that I think the legislators were intending. And so that is good in the sense that there is more runway to provide feedback and to engage in the process. But I would absolutely watch Section 1001 and the RTR business as complementary to the whole home repairs provision around this big question of how do we get a lot of older housing stock that is in desperate need of TLC back into service and back into stock that's available for occupancy. So I definitely watch that as well.
I wanted to go back a little bit to the housing finance topic. I think Mike did a good job of laying out how it doesn't actually directly touch low income housing tax credits or light tech, I guess we usually say for short. But it still changes some of the parameters of how that credit is extended. Maybe Elizabeth or Jackie, who since you work so heavily in those areas, like, how impactful is that? And, should that be followed up with actual changes to the Light Tech program to, actually get that even more momentum going?
I think Jackie's probably the expert, but just from a developer perspective, I think pricing and investor appetite is market driven. So there's not really a policy fix in this legislation or paired with this legislation that could really help that. I think there's probably a lot, of reform we could do to make, for example, CRA considerations obviously would make investor appetite a lot more healthy, especially right now. But yeah, unfortunately, I mean, I think it's great that they increased the public welfare investment cap. It obviously makes it a lot easier, but until the market lines up with the demand, and it's great. We also, not part of this legislation, but we also had the reduction of the 50% test in the bond program. We have, a higher cap on 9% credits. Those are all excellent policy changes, but until the market meets demand, I don't see like pricing changing all that much or investor appetite changing all that much. Maybe Jackie has more more optimistic outlook than that, but that's what I'm seeing.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I don't know that I have a more optimistic frame here, unfortunately, because all those things are true. I do think, not necessarily directly related to this act or anything in this act, but I think, preservation has really been the conversation that's getting elevated. And that is certainly a space that here at the Commission, we've been taking steps to really lift up. We have a really deep need for preservation. and balancing in this moment too. What is the appetite? Is there maybe a change in appetite? Is there a little more appetite for some preservation projects and working on that in that vein? But I think that, yeah, investor appetite is a really big driver. So anything that we can do that helps attract investment is always good. But still, at the end of the day, they're going to be responsive to varying things. And I think just this piece around anything that signals some shift or uncertainty that sends people into the gray area of like, I don't really know what might come of XYZ legislation, just always has such a dramatic effect on the investor market. So I think those are the things of, I don't think I have anything super positive other than I think we're trying to take advantage of this moment in time and see where, like, is there more appetite to reinvest in the portfolio? And so that's kind of where we're putting a lot of our energy. And just thinking about some things are not policy, they're more about strategy. Like, is there just a different strategy about when we allocate resources, or is there something else that we can be doing differently? I think some of those things are pretty TBD, and understanding, what are the shifts and drivers for our investor community? What are they really looking for? Is also a key piece. But yeah, the CRA stuff is pretty big and a little scary. So again, kind of lift up that one for folks to help with some advocacy, I think, on that front. But all these other pieces around gap financing are huge. And so if also appropriations comes through and the flexibility in different programs and the streamlining, like if all of these pieces came together, that would be like super impactful. I think we definitely operate in the sphere of not any one thing doesn't get it done. We need all the things to move and get done.
I agree, and I want to add to what Jackie said in that a housing tax bill is overdue, and we got the bond test done in reconciliation, but there's Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, which I know a number of folks on this call are interested in / supportive of. Talking with the folks at Novogradac and NCSHA, I understand there are proposals floating around the idea of individual accredited investors buying tax credits directly, which could go a long way in boosting demand for that product. And so I think there are creative ways to, it's not as though, this is sort of, we are subject to the whims of the market and we don't have agency. I think there's a lot we can do through tax policy, but it's going to require a lot of advocacy. I will just say through this process, I have been very pleasantly surprised by how well Senator Wyden and Senator Crapo have worked together. And I believe that, the Idaho folks who have been in Crapo's ear have been incredibly helpful setting the stage for that kind of conversation. So I would just say, as we wrap this up and look ahead to not just 27 and 28, but ahead to the next administration, what is an HR 1 for housing need to contain? If we want to rebuild HUD, if we want to make existing programs work better, we are putting out the call to all of our partners and friends out there that we need your ideas, because we are very eager to move beyond road and build on road, because as I said at the outset, there's just so much the federal government has to play so much more a role here, And I think we have the opportunity off the heels of passage of this bill to get there, to move that ball forward. But we absolutely need engagement and importantly ideas from folks on the ground and on this call who are doing the work to help us understand really where the opportunities are to prioritize efforts and take advantage of the political moment that housing finds itself in.
All right, we are just about at time, but I thought if it's okay if we go slightly over time. I thought I'd let everyone get a chance for a final word if they wanted on, whether that's what comes next or what, if anything, other further thoughts on implementation steps on this bill that you'll be watching or other legislation, because obviously it's a whole ecosystem of things, and the state has been doing exciting things. Some localities have been doing really exciting things. Um, and it sort of feels like we're rowing in the same direction, but obviously that's only it's part of the time, and sometimes it's not too harmonious. So yeah, if anybody has any other last thoughts.
I mean, I guess I'll just say I think this is an impressive framework, even though there's a lot to fill out, right? It feels like one of those like wreath frames where you have to still put all the stuff on it, but the framework is there. And I'm impressed that they got this through, given what's happening otherwise in our federal government. So it seems like whatever the strategy that was happening to get this done in a bipartisan way, and to get all these little good housekeeping things taken care of in one laundry list of a bill is impressive politics, and it is the kind of thing that restores your faith that the federal government can do big things, even whether there's other stuff going on. So I'm excited about it, even though I think we're years from seeing the real impacts.
I agree, and I'm looking forward to a big tax reform bill sometime in the future. Maybe.
Yeah, maybe I'll like echo that thread. Like it does feel like this is the framework for the long game, and then how we continue to build on that momentum and lift up, tax legislation that had advocacy behind it and is just kind of waiting to go and find the vehicle that the momentum keeps going. Yeah.
Yeah, and part of the thing we're answering on is uh, the interest in light tech goes down when you cut taxes because there's less tax liability out there. So uh, something to think about, especially when in light of keeping deficits and all of that. So I guess we will leave it on that thought. Anything else, Patience, or should we call it a panel?
Let's call the panel. This was a great discussion. I will just make a call for the Community Reinvestment Act changes, the rulemaking that's underway. We need to all lean in and advocate against those changes. They will continue to incentivize investors in light tech projects and affordable housing, even in grant support for community development. So we'll be putting out calls for action, and if you can sign your organization on, please do. Now is the time. I think we have a very limited window to October 13th for us to do that. But otherwise, thank you all for a great discussion, and thank you for all you do to house people here in King County. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.